On the morning of the 11th of October 1921, the world's media watched as Michael Collins bounded through the door of 10 Downing Street. Moments later, he shook hands with the British Prime Minister. So began the first day of the most important political negotiations in modern Anglo Irish history. Nearly 2 months later, in the early hours of the 6th of December 1921, the talks culminated in the signing of what is now known simply as the Treaty, a document that had been designed to end one violent conflict but which soon gave rise to another. A century on from its signing, award-winning journalist Gretchen Fiemann has produced a gripping account of the tense and protracted negotiations between the Irish and British delegations, shining a fresh light on the complex politics and high-stakes bargaining that produced the agreement. The book is entitled simply The Treaty, the gripping story of the negotiations that brought about Irish independence and led to the Civil War. And Gretchen joins me on the line now. Gretchen Fiemann, good evening to you and welcome to the programme.
Good evening.
You're very welcome indeed. Can I say, first of all, it's a wonderful read, and not least because it brings us through the intensity of those negotiations from the 11th of October 1921 to the 6th of December 1921. But before we look at those negotiations over those couple of months, the political situation that existed in both Ireland and Britain at that time.
It's crucial to have some understanding of the political situation in both Ireland and Britain, because it really informed how the negotiations played out. So in Ireland, I guess the most important thing really was the fact that the truce had come into force on the 11th of July, and there was really a sort of sense of elation and exhaustion at this point. Elation that the fighting was finally over, but exhaustion as well at this endless war that had gone on for 2 years. And at this point, people were really crying out for peace. That's what they wanted. At the same time, there was a sense that the IRA were these absolute heroes, and they were feted as such by many in the community, because they had effectively, in the minds of many, they had effectively fought the British to a standstill. So the problem with this, though, was that in the last 6 months of the War of Independence, and particularly after the truce, discipline within the IRA was becoming more and more of a problem. And so on top of this great question of sovereignty, how they were going to negotiate a lasting settlement with the British, the Dáil Cabinet also had this concern about mounting law and mounting disorder out in the country at large. So those were the concerns preying upon their minds. And also it's important to realize that the revolutionary movement really wasn't as cohesive. It started to fracture more and more after the truce. So that sense of solidarity of standing as one against the enemy, Britain, that was beginning to break down more and more after the truce. So really I sort of think when the Dáil first met in mid-August, this is the second Dáil, they hadn't met before the truce, and the Dáil Cabinet, of course, had been on the run throughout the War of Independence. And so De Valera, he had to, M. De Valera was at that time made officially president of this Irish Republic counter-state. He had to not only sort of try and impose some sort of centralized civilian structure, on this country that's been subject to so much strife over the past years, but he also had to hold the Republican movement together somehow, and to get them to rally around this idea of, it was inevitably going to involve unholy compromises. So he needed to get them to understand that they weren't going to be able to have a standalone republic, and this is the one. This is the one perplexing thing about De Valera. He sort of struck so many different stances during this time, right up until well into 1922 and 1923. So I think that's the key thing to remember when you're thinking about the Irish side. You've got this idea that the society is fracturing, law and order is a problem. Also, on top of that, you've got the revolutionary movement itself beginning to not fall apart. That's not true, but certainly the centre was not holding as it had during the War of Independence. And then you've got these frictions and various conflicting political ambitions within the elite of the revolutionary movement. And most particularly that is evident in the Dáil cabinet. So you've got Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack, who are the sort of real hardliners against Michael Collins, who's a major force in the IRA. He's not the chief of staff, that's Richard Mulcahy. He's also Minister of Finance, and he is also the president of the IRB. So Collins and Arthur Griffiths, he's also a moderate. So I think these are the tensions within the Irish situation prior to the treaty.
Now, in relation to London, Lloyd George was the Prime Minister at the time. It was a coalition government. And Lloyd George, as head of a coalition government with a unionist majority, his position in his own cabinet was a weak one. And I presume that in the face of the intransigence of Sir James Craig and the Ulster Unionists, his room for manoeuvre was very limited too.
Yes, his room for manoeuvre was extremely limited, but also because, I guess, the Conservative Party had been the traditional unquestioning supporter of Ulster, of the Ulster Unionists, and this was going to be a huge problem because how were they going to try and square, a settlement with Ireland and also keep the Conservative Party happy as a whole, and how was this going to change the Conservative Party's relations with the Ulster Unionists? But yes, I mean, in relation to Lloyd George, you've got to remember, he didn't have a political party as such, so he was the Liberal Prime Minister of a Liberal Conservative coalition. And throughout 1921, I mean, throughout May and June, he suffered a few risky, I guess, Lloyd George began to believe that his premiership was under attack. So in May and June, he suffered a few attacks from Churchill and Lord Birkenhead, who he thought were in league against him and that they were going to actually try and somehow unseat him. So he had to tackle these manoeuvres against him. And he also was very lucky in the fact that Andrew Bonar-Law, who was this Ulster Unionist hardliner, he had left the Conservative Party. He was the Conservative leader up until the start of 1921, and then in came Austen Chamberlain. And Austen Chamberlain was a completely different kettle of fish to Andrew Bonar-Law. He was a real loyalist. He didn't have this visceral attachment to Ulster. So I guess what Lloyd George managed to achieve in the run-up to the treaty talks was really to neutralise the antagonisms he was enduring from Churchill and Lord Birkenhead. And he bound those two ministers close to him in this idea that they were going to try and solve the Irish question together and then extend the coalition's government, the coalition's time in power. And on top of this, he had, which was so fortunate for him, he had a Conservative leader who was amenable to this. And so I think although Lloyd George did have terrible problems with the Conservative Party because obviously the far right were very bellicose and they didn't like the idea of a negotiation with Sinn Féin, Lloyd George had managed to manoeuvre himself into a position where the most powerful people within the coalition were on his side eventually.
And his offer to De Valera, I think it's fair to say that it was considerably in advance of the meagre measure of Home Rule embodied in the Government of Ireland Act, but it fell far short of Republican aspirations, and it ensured really that British interests would be paramount. was it obvious that this was going to present difficulties when De Valera returned to Dublin and presented this to the Second Dáil?
Yeah. Well, yes, it was obvious that. First of all, let's remember that when Lloyd George presented the 20th of July proposal to De Valera in London, Lloyd George said this is as far as we're going to go, and in fact, really they didn't deviate very much from that. But De Valera immediately rejected it. I mean, turned it down straight away. Said we won't accept that. And as soon as he did that, Lloyd George sort of threatened war, a renewed war. So when De Valera went back to the Dáil, I mean, he made sure that he was officially recognised by the Dáil as the president of the Republic, but he also then sought to downplay expectations that there was going to be a pure republic as a result of these negotiations. And, he, on the 16th of August, for example, he said, we're not Republican doctrinaires. And a few days later, he told deputies that they really should forget about any recognition of the Republic from the US. And then to drive it home, he added that it was really going to be difficult to shift the British from the position they had adopted, which, of course, was Dominion status. That's what they were offering, with various conditions. And he warned everyone that if they were determined to make peace only on the basis of the recognition of the Republic, they were going to face war. And if it was war, it was effectively going to be a Sherman's march. So, you can see there that he's really trying to manage expectations and to banish any thought that anyone was going to achieve and a pure republic.
And the stalemate was resolved when Lloyd George issued a fresh invitation on the 29th of September to a conference in London on the 11th of October, which was accepted by the Republican cabinet. And this invitation for the 11th of October, according to Lloyd George, was, "We can meet your delegates as spokesmen of the people whom you represent, with the view to ascertaining how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations."
Mm.
So I suppose implicit in this formula from the outset, it would reasonably seem with some form of constitutional compromise. Would that be correct?
In the sense that Lloyd George is... are you saying that Lloyd George is backing down his position there? Because he didn't ever... I guess what the real... the tussle between Lloyd George and De Valera over that summer and going into up to the end of September was really, was Ireland going to renounce her claim for complete independence prior to these substantive negotiations? And he didn't succeed in that objective. Lloyd George did not succeed in that objective. But equally, neither did De Valera. I mean, De Valera did not succeed in having Lloyd George except that Ireland was effectively an independent nation. So, they sort of struck a compromise, I guess. It was a bit of a fudge. And but I think what we have to remember is going into these negotiations and then throughout those talks, there really was never any sense, any moment even, that Lloyd George and his cabinet were ever going to accept anything other than Dominion status. That was just not on the cards.
It's the case, effectively, that there could not possibly be a sovereign republic at the end of these negotiations, and I presume that what Lloyd George was hoping from De Valera, that De Valera would abandon any claim to a sovereign republic, but that, of course, would have been political suicide.
Yes. Well, I mean, you can perhaps argue that both leaders were continually sort of throughout the summer negotiations and then throughout the treaty talks kind of defending themselves against accusations of apostasy from their own followers. And I think this is, there is a great paradox in De Valera's position, because he really, I don't think you could ever argue that De Valera was an ideological Republican. He had, in 1920, I think, talked about Ireland accepting something close to the Monroe, or similar to the Monroe doctrine that governed Cuban and U.S. relations. So, and when he's, during that summer of 1921, when he was talking to the Dáil about you're never going to get this standalone republic, he kept emphasizing this idea that was really about, rather than use the word republic, and I think he used it, maybe not only 2 times, I think, in the correspondence with Lloyd George, and then really not at all, I think, during the treaty talks. But he talked about the consent of the governed, of it was always referring back to this idea of the Wilsonian principle of self-determination. It was really, he didn't harp on about republicanism.
And then
and then I was going to say that the problem is that toward the end of the talks, he became extremely aggressive, in the sense that he was really saber-rattling in terms of saying, we're not going to accept Dominion status, and we're not going to accept any intrusion of the Crown into the internal affairs of Ireland, and really trying to rally the nation for a renewed war rather than a compromise with the British. So he was accused by many in the Dáil after the treaty split of, just having first told everyone not to expect a republic prior to the talks, and then not deciding that he wasn't going to go and put his reputation on the line in London, and then during the treaty talks, rushing back to the rock of republicanism.
The Irish delegation, it was appointed by the Republican cabinet and then ratified by the Dáil, Gretchen, but how was it actually put together so that you had the likes of Michael Collins, you had Robert Barton, Arthur Griffith, then George Gavin Duffy and Eamon Duggan were there because of their legal knowledge. How was that delegation put together, and why was De Valera, whom most people would have thought should have led it, certainly led it along with Collins, why was he not part of it?
Yes, well, you could say another sign of De Valera's moderate stance, if you like, or at least his repudiation of a standalone republic, is the fact that he appointed a known moderate, Arthur Griffith, to lead as the head of the delegation. And Arthur Griffith had already indicated that he was not going to break on the Crown, and that this for him was not a red line issue. So Arthur Griffith was appointed as the head of the delegation, and then Collins, second in command, if you like, who was another moderate, as I've already said. That's 2 people who are already sort of inclined to a compromise along Dominion status lines, who are leading the negotiations. But to counter that, or to balance that out, this is the way he sort of explained it in his letter to Joe McGarity after the treaty split. That was written in December 1921. He sort of tried to excuse his actions and say, look, I thought that we could hold Griffith and Collins from crossing the line. I thought we could hold them back. And so in many ways it looks as if he did compose the delegation in order for it to be paralysed, in order for it to be unable to make any substantive decision, and then made sure of that by undermining their plenipotentiary status. So just go back to the delegates again. So Robert Barton, who is Minister for Economic Affairs, and he's the cousin of Erskine Childers. Now, Erskine Childers is a fascinating character. He's the confidant of De Valera, and so many within the Sinn Féin movement were getting pretty fed up with Erskine Childers because they saw him as the gatekeeper to De Valera, and found it frustrating that they couldn't get through to De Valera without having to first go through Erskine Childers. But he was very effective. He was, especially in terms of the propaganda, directing the propaganda during the War of Independence. But So Erskine Chillis is appointed Chief Secretary. He's known to be a hardline Republican. He's the cousin of Robert Barton. And on the hardline side, if you like, or less inclined to compromise, is George Gavin Duffy. His father was actually the Premier of Victoria at one point. And then there's Eamon Duggan, who's sometimes described sort of as a cipher for Collins, which I guess is a little unfair. He was he played an important role in terms of liaising with the Dublin Castle civil servants. So he was very familiar with people like Alfred Cope, who played a pivotal role in the negotiations. And we shouldn't forget how important those lesser figures were in terms of, one, pushing the Sinn Féin towards a truce, but also in terms of the treaty. Cope and Tom Jones, who was the Deputy Secretary of Cabinet, they were really crucial to inveigling themselves into, I guess, the trust of, or the confidence of the Sinn Féin delegates. I mean, the access they had to the Sinn Féin delegates was extraordinary, and it wasn't reciprocated. It's not as if the Irish Secretariat could go over to the British camp and start to have conversations about tactics and strategy and how they were going to try and structure future meetings, etc. So it was extraordinary that those civil servants had that access, but it was also reflective, I think, of the fact that during the War of Independence, in order to get to the truce situation, the Sinn Féin leaders had to talk. They had to be accessible to the Dublin City, the Dublin Castle civil servants.
And once the negotiations got underway, Gretchen, what would you say the main points at issue were for both sides?
Well, I mean, the main issues were sovereignty for the Irish. They spent most of their time concerned about this, and that's exemplified really in the final Dáil cabinet meeting, which is before they signed the treaty. They had a Dáil cabinet meeting on the 3rd of December, which went on for many, many hours. And the subject that monopolised everybody's attention was sovereignty and the role of the Crown. So that was the key issue for Ireland. I mean, in many ways, it was the same for Britain. I mean, you've got to remember that at this time, there was no way that the British were going to compromise on Dominion status, because their relations with, I mean, in the broader context of things, Britain was trying to recast its imperial relations, and it was trying to cling on to its superpower status, and it couldn't do that really if it had a republic on its doorstep. I mean, this was going to be really bad news for Egypt and India. I mean, eventually with Egypt, the British came to an agreement in February 1922, I think it was, and they ended this 4 decades of occupation. But, you know, it's very important to remember that when the British were when the British were negotiating with the Irish, they weren't doing so in isolation. They were looking at the Irish situation in the context of their broader imperial problems, if you like. You know, the broader problems in the empire, the idea that, you know, nationalist movements were raging on many fronts, and the Dominions were looking for more independence. And, you know, all of these factors played on the minds with the British negotiators.
And Gretchen, once the negotiations got underway, how difficult were they? And was there any occasion when there was the possibility that they would actually collapse? Because you go through, in the book, in great detail the various aspects of the negotiations, but obviously we can't do that here. But how would you describe the negotiations over the almost 2 months? Well,
I mean, there were so many so many pressure points, but it's really important not to look at the negotiations in those last 48 hours. The dynamic evolved over almost 2 months. So there were, on the 21st of October, for example, there was a very fractious meeting between the Irish and the British. The Irish had the British had uncovered an IRA gun running. Discovered this sort of hoard of guns, so knew that the IRA were still carrying out these gun running missions, and they were furious about that. Then there was the problem with De Valera, who had sent a telegram to the Pope and then published it in the newspapers, arguing that the problems in Ireland were not the Irish people's making; it was really Britain's fault. There were a huge number of pressure points, and on top of this, not only were there pressure points and moments when the negotiations were close to collapse, and I think pretty much every few days almost the negotiations looked as if they were going to collapse. It was never an easy process. But on top of this, the Irish delegation was beginning to fragment more and more. So on the 26th of October, for example, they sent this letter back to De Valera saying, you've got to stop interfering. As De Valera said, well, we're all at one here on saying that we should face war rather than accept the crown. So I'm paraphrasing, something to that effect. And so this incensed Collins and Griffith, and that really didn't. Although all the delegates signed that letter, it wasn't as much of an issue clearly for Barton and Gavin Duffy as it was for Griffith and Collins. And so then you get the pivotal moment of the night in Churchill's house, where Griffith and Collins go on their own to meet the British negotiators. Griffith goes upstairs and talks to Lloyd George for about 45 minutes, and gives his consent that if Britain can deliver essential unity, then he'll accept some variation of some association with the crown. And then I don't know how much detail I can go into because I know you're pressed for time. But anyways, this launches a huge argument in the delegation, and because Griffith is really forced into the position of having to produce a document for Lloyd George, or a letter to Lloyd George, setting out in writing his promise that he is going to accept essential unity. Accept the crown if Lloyd George can deliver essential unity. And the haggling and the acrimony and just the despair that starts to set in the Irish delegation, as it looks as if Griffiths, according to Erskine Childers and Robert Barton and George Gavin Duffy, they think he's starting to crumble. They think he's starting to backslide and undermine the Irish position. So this just gets worse and worse and worse, and it reaches a crescendo, of course, in the final 48 hours when ultimately Griffith capitulates with unilaterally states that he's going to accept the treaty in this penultimate meeting, because the British had offered some concessions on defence and on trade. And I think Griffith was just sick and tired of this awful menace of war that hung over the negotiations all the time. And so he sort of laid down his arms and said, right, okay, I'll accept this treaty. And of course, the Articles of Association, as they were known at that time, and that really destroyed any residual cohesion within the Irish delegation, and the rest of them pretty much folded after that. And of course, there was the dramatic scene. Do you want me to quickly go through that? There was that very dramatic occasion when Lloyd George said it's not enough that Griffith signed. He wants all of the delegates to sign, because he knew that if they referred it back to Dublin, there was never going to be a settlement. And I think you've got to understand that he was not just worried about the hardliners in Dublin. He was also worried about the hardliners in the Tory party, and he probably just wanted to have a fait accompli and to say, to both sets of hardliners, it's done. This is what we have. So he puts them under ferocious pressure and produces two letters and says, holds up one letter and says, I've got a destroyer waiting, and then there's an express train direct to Belfast, and I'm going to send. If I send this letter, it says that you have accepted the settlement and peace has been established. And if I send this other letter, then the settlement has not been accepted, and the alternative to this settlement is war, and war within 3 days. So.
Can I just bring you towards the end? The Dáil met on the 14th of December 1921 to commence discussions on the ratification or rejection of the treaty, and the book says that a document which had been designed to end one violent conflict soon gave rise to another. Was that second violent conflict, was that inevitable?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question to answer. I think, as I said at the beginning, the tensions within the movement had been evident for some time, and you could say that the treaty was the catalyst for the Civil War. But again, you also have to dwell on De Valera's actions, because he had decided that straight away he was not going to accept the treaty, and I think. You could argue that perhaps was a mistake, that it wasn't a million miles away from external association, and ultimately De Valera did, through the treaty and through the constitutional machinery that the treaty established, he did lead Ireland into its status as a republic. So. I don't know. It's a very difficult answer. It's a very difficult question to answer. I think that many historians would say that the treaty was simply the catalyst, but really it was inevitable that there was going to be a civil war, because the fundamental questions about what the country looked like, how it was going to be governed, what was worth fighting for, what level of independence was worth fighting for. None of these questions had been resolved by the time the delegation set out for London.
Very good. Well, it's a fascinating read, the treaty, the gripping story of the negotiations that brought about Irish independence and led to the Civil War. It's published by Merrion Press. And Gretchen Fiemann, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme this evening.
Thank you so much.
And that brings us to almost 23 minutes to 6 o'clock. We'll take a break.